Welcome to another episode of China Update, where I provide you with the most up-to-date political, economic, and geostrategic analysis on the world's number 2 economy. My name is Tony. Let's jump in.
Happy Tuesday, everybody. Let's begin with the markets. Yesterday, Temu owner Pinduoduo stock plunged 28% on the Nasdaq. The Chinese-owned e-commerce platform reported revenue of 97.1 billion yuan, $13.6 billion for the June quarter, missing the average estimate of 100 billion yuan. Pinduoduo faced a backlash back in July when hundreds of merchants staged a rally outside its offices in southern China. They protested what they called unfair penalties that Temu's owner was increasingly levying. A statement from the company may have spooked investors too, with the chairman and co-chief executive officer of Pinduoduo Holdings expressing with the Q2 results, quote, "We are committed to transitioning towards high-quality development and fostering sustainable ecosystem. We will invest heavily in the platform's trust and safety, support high-quality merchants, and relentlessly improve the merchant ecosystem. We are prepared to accept short-term sacrifices and potential decline in profitability." End quote. The company has spent big on e-commerce business Temu to drive its global presence and escape an ailing Chinese economy. However, Wang Xiaoyan, a Shanghai-based analyst with 86 Research, told clients in a note yesterday, quote, "Going forward, Pinduoduo will face fierce competition in China, with merchants going through a hard time. Pinduoduo will likely invest more in China, and that means we'll see downside for the group in the Chinese market." End quote. Bloomberg Intelligence expressed in a note, quote, "Pinduoduo's indication on the 26th of August of lower profitability as the company boosts spending to tackle increased global competition suggests downside to earnings consensus, which is projecting higher margins into 2025. This, along with Pinduoduo's first revenue miss in 10 quarters for the 3 months ended June, looks set to dampen the growth outlook for the next 12 months. End quote. Next up, the big story in US-China relations is US National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan's visit to Beijing this week. Expectations for outcomes should be low. We will do a review of the visit after it's concluded, but for now let's look at salient points to note before the visit. The trip may help lay the groundwork for a leader meeting at APEC in Peru a week after the US election. The trip this week isn't expected to result in any major breakthroughs, with the 3 Ts, trade, technology and Taiwan, likely on the agenda. The US will also likely raise concerns about what it this week called aggressive Chinese actions towards the Philippines, a US ally, which we covered in yesterday's video in the South China Sea, as well as accusations of Beijing supporting Russia's war in Ukraine. Unfortunately, Beijing officials continue to push the line that the US is solely to blame for the deterioration in the bilateral relationship, and that all the US has to do is, quote, "correct its perception of China," end quote. Su Xiaohui, Deputy Director of the China Institute of International Studies, Department of American Studies, for example, expressed in state media this week, quote, "China is using communication to further shape the bilateral ties in an active way, and it does not shy away from addressing existing issues and challenges, including the US perception of China." End quote. Both sides know that the two powers are firmly in a new period of structural competition, and continuing to pretend that Washington just needs to educate itself is counterproductive. Yesterday, the PRC Foreign Ministry issued a detailed briefing that lays out their concerns and likely agenda items for the meetings this week. This is a useful document to examine, as it acts as a laundry list of grievances that Beijing has, giving us a look into how Beijing's policy elite are thinking about the relationship. Obviously, this is very biased towards Beijing's position, but that's exactly why we are examining it. Let's look at a few excerpts. Quote, "The upcoming visit will also be the first visit to China by National Security Advisor to the US President after 8 years, and the first visit to China by National Security Advisor Sullivan. The United States has kept containing and suppressing China, and China has taken resolute countermeasures. The US-China relationship is still at a critical juncture of being stabilized. Against this backdrop, Director Wang Yi will have an in-depth exchange of views with National Security Advisor Sullivan on China-US relations, sensitive issues, and major international and regional hotspots. The Chinese side will focus on raising serious concerns, articulating its position and laying out serious demands on issues related to the Taiwan question, the right to development, and China's strategic security. The Taiwan question is the first and foremost red line that must not be crossed in US-China relations, and Taiwan independence is the biggest risk to peace and stability in the Taiwan Strait. The US side's continuous arbitrary measures against China in the areas of tariffs, export control, investment review, and unilateral sanctions seriously undermine China's legitimate rights and interests. China demands that the US side stop turning economic and trade issues into political and security issues. On the South China Sea issue, China's territorial sovereignty and maritime rights and interests in the region have sufficient historical and legal basis, and that countries in the region have full confidence, wisdom, and capability to properly handle the issue. Countries outside the region should not do things that provoke confrontation or increase tensions. Responding to the US's unwarranted accusation that China is a threat to the international order, China's development is an important part of human progress and an inevitable trend in the evolution of history. End quote. Meanwhile, over the weekend, the US added 105 Russian and Chinese firms to a trade restriction list over their alleged support of the Russian military, as Washington seeks to keep up pressure on Moscow's war effort in Ukraine. The companies, 63 Russian, 42 Chinese, as well as 18 from other countries, were targeted for a host of reasons, from sending US electronics to Russian military-related parties to producing thousands of Shahed-136 drones for Russia to use in Ukraine. On Sunday, Beijing urged the US to, quote, stop its wrong practices, end quote, adding it was, quote, fully opposed to the sanctions and will take necessary measures to resolutely safeguard the legitimate rights and interests of Chinese companies, end quote. Now, we note that Sullivan and China's top diplomat Wang Yi have met before, several times, in fact, most consequently in Vienna in May 2023 for a highly secretive meeting. This week, UK-based The Financial Times, citing multiple unnamed sources, reported on that visit and other meetings between the two. Sullivan reportedly told Wang that while China was angry about US technology export controls, it should consider its own policies, using an analogy of stock versus flow. But Wang Yi was adamant that the US was trying to contain China's economic rise with its so-called small yard, high fence export control strategy. An unnamed US official told the outlet, quote, technology is a massive priority for them. They do not accept the underlying premise of what they see as essentially the securitization of the technology relationship, when they view it as fundamentally about core economics and innovation and not about national security. End quote. This comment provoked a sharp rebuke from veteran China analyst Bill Bishop, who said, quote, does this US official actually believe it is not about national security? That is deeply worrying if someone involved in US policy towards China thinks the Chinese side sees technology as fundamentally about core economics and innovation and not about national security. They must be totally clueless about Xi Jinping's thoughts on comprehensive national security. Next up, we have one more development to cover, but just quickly, if you're getting some value from today's episode, don't forget to hit the like button. Liking, sharing, and subscribing are the only ways in which the channel can grow. It's a tremendous help for the channel, and it's a big help for me. Thank you so much. Meanwhile, speaking of deteriorating trade, today we learned that Canada has decided to follow the EU and the US with tariffs on Chinese EVs. It was announced that the government of Canada intends to implement a 100% tariff on all Chinese-made EVs, effective the 1st of October this year. This includes electric and certain hybrid passenger automobiles, as well as other vehicles. The federal government also intends to apply a 25% surtax on imports of steel and aluminum for our American friends, products from China, effective the 15th of October this year. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau said Ottawa was acting to counter what he called China's intentional state-directed policy of overcapacity, telling reporters, quote, I think we all know that China is not playing by the same rules, end quote. It was also announced that Canada will launch a second 30-day consultation concerning, quote, other sectors critical to Canada's future prosperity, including batteries and battery parts, semiconductors, solar products, and critical minerals. A consultation notice will be released in the coming days to help inform any further government action, end quote. The Canadian Finance Ministry said China's, quote, intentional state-directed policy of overcapacity and lack of rigorous labour and environmental standards end quote, threaten workers and businesses in the global EV industry and undermine Canada's long-term economic prosperity. Interestingly, before his Beijing trip, Jake Sullivan made a stop in Halifax to discuss a range of national security priorities in the US-Canada bilateral relationship. And on this theme of trade with China, he expressed, quote, Canada ultimately will determine its own trade policy. It's not for the US to try to dictate, end quote. Though, he critically added, quote, the US does believe that a united front, a coordinated approach on these issues benefits all of us, end quote. Car making is one of Canada's most important manufacturing sectors, with plants clustered around the Great Lakes area to supply customers in the United States. The sector directly employs almost 120,000 people. We end with this observation from Peking University Professor of Finance Michael Pettis. Quote, it shouldn't surprise anyone that retaliatory trade measures are spreading from country to country. As Joan Robinson explained many decades ago, when a group of large economies use trade surpluses to expand domestic employment at the expense of trade partners, countries that don't play along are worse off than countries that do. And the more countries take defensive steps, the more pressure there is on the rest to do the same. End quote. Okay, that is today's episode of China Update. Thank you so much, everybody, for watching. Have a good Tuesday, and I will see you all tomorrow.